Okay, hi everybody. Happy Wednesday. It's Spencer again from Abu Dhabi. So I think Monday's presentation went okay based on the feedback I got from Dr. Barton. Hopefully everybody else felt it was okay as well. I didn't leave too much time for discussion, so apologies for that, but I'll try to do better with the next two presentations. So today what we're going to talk about is some virtual environment research and then move on to motion sickness. So the three papers we'll cover are the Vora et al. Article, the Reason and Brandt article, and Bless et al. So before we get into the meat and potatoes of things, when I did my presentation Monday and recorded it, I sent it to my wife to take a look at before I put it up on YouTube, just to get her feedback. And she said it was pretty good. The one thing she said it was missing was maybe a picture of the presenter, because it's just me talking for 30 minutes, and she thought maybe it'd be a good idea to give you guys a visual of what I actually look like. So here's what I look like, and so you guys have a understanding or a visual anyways as to the face behind the voice. And this is a recent picture. I think it was taken maybe back in December, January. One of the nice things about living in Abu Dhabi is that the weather here is pretty much ideal from November through till May. It gets really, really hot in the summertime, but other than that, it's quite good, which is quite a bit different, obviously, than back in Idaho, and quite a bit different than back in Canada, especially this past winter. So there's me, and let's get moving on to the more important things. So this first article, the topic of it was using a VR, virtual reality system, in aircraft inspection training. So there's a situation here where 90% of aircraft inspection is visual and it's conducted by humans. And obviously there's a need for high reliability in this task. So we want to make sure that we detect the defects at as high a hit rate as possible. The existing training is mostly done on the job, but one of the problems with this is that it lacks feedback. And the reason for this is primarily because feedback in the on-the-job training environment costs quite a bit of money. It's extra bodies, it's extra training, extra resources, extra skill, which affects the bottom line. So what they've done is employed this computer-based training methodology, which has shown to be effective, but it lacks some realism, and this is primarily due to the technological issues associated with the CBT environment. The basic hypothesis in this article is that if we had better realism through a virtual reality or virtual environment instead of this computer-based training environment, it would lead to an increased sense of presence. And this increased sense of presence would then lead to a better transfer of training into the real-world environment. So as we spoke about, I think last time, presence is basically this level of vividness or interaction with a certain experience, in this case, a virtual environment. So the virtual reality used in the study was designed using a task analytic method, top-down systematic approach, which I think is music to our ears in the human factors world, where they look at something and try to arrive at a solution in a top-down way, looking at the functions and tasks and then breaking it down from there. So maybe the authors of this article read the Stanley article from last time, which certainly trumpeted the importance of using a systematic approach when developing virtual environments. So the virtual environment models were quite realistic in the study. They used head-mounted displays, and they used this virtual flashlight, which simulated what inspectors in the real world might use in dark situations. So the first of the two studies that Vora et al. Conducted was to measure presence of this using this virtual reality environment that they created. So in order to measure presence, they used two different questionnaires. Well, the first thing they did was they measured immersive tendencies of the subjects using this ITQ questionnaire. And then they also measured the presence that was experienced by each subject within the virtual reality world. So the results that they obtained, the first, a high immersive tendency of a subject correlates to high presence experienced within the virtual reality environment, which in my mind makes quite a bit of sense. Somebody who has a tendency to immerse themselves in something would then be more likely to experience a high level of presence in a virtual world. They also identified that there's a greater perceived involvement in virtual environments, which correlates to a high perception of virtual environment realism. So when people were perceived to be more involved in the virtual environment, that made them feel like it was more realistic. They identified that there were some issues with the control of the virtual environment. Most people didn't feel that this was a natural thing. One of the reasons for this was a significant time lag, at least a perceived significant time lag of the images and the visuals in the virtual world. And this is a technical issue, obviously. And I think this was in 2002. You'd expect, 10 plus years later, that some of these technical snags are probably smoothed over, or at least better than they were in 2002. And the last result was that overall virtual reality systems scored well on measures of presence. So the design of the virtual world did give people a strong sense of presence when they were in it, using it, which bodes well to the initial hypothesis. So the second study was a comparison of the computer-based training with this virtual reality training. The computer-based training, I think, is called ASSIST, which is an acronym that stands for Automated System of Self-Instruction for Specialized Training. So a bit of a mouthful. You can see why they came up with an acronym to spell that out. The results of this study demonstrated that virtual reality scored better than the CBT on most questions. So this was a questionnaire that the researchers developed themselves. The one area where the CBT was better was in system responsiveness. So again, even though people had issues with the technical aspects of the virtual reality in the presence questionnaires, the same kind of thing was evident in this questionnaire, where the CBT performed better from a technical standpoint than the virtual reality. The virtual reality was perceived as more immersive and provided higher level of involvement, which again is to be expected. And the virtual reality performance data was also better. So people detected more defects, and the search times were lower in detecting these defects. So a potential discussion point for you guys. You can either stop the presentation now and have a chat, or maybe wait till the end. And just something to consider. So it's clear that virtual reality provides for some benefits for transfer of training and of some skills and tasks. Do you guys see any risks of using virtual reality for training? And when I talk about risks, I know last class, I guess on Monday, identified some health and safety type risks or social implications that need to be considered for designing virtual environments. But in this case, I'm more talking about things like if you equate, say, virtual reality to automation. And there's issues with automation, I think, as we've discussed earlier in the semester, specifically with reliance on automation and trust, either lack of trust or over-trust on automation. Those types of risks or potential negatives of the automation, do those types of things, do you think that they would be risks when using virtual reality? So that's something maybe for everybody to have a quick chat about. So moving away a little bit from virtual environments or virtual reality, we'll talk now about motion sickness. So the last two papers that were meant to be read for today talk about motion sickness. The Reason and Brandt article gives a good history, actually, of motion sickness and the different theories behind it, and basically where we were and how we got to where we are now, or at least how we got to where they were in 1975. But even between 75 and 40 years, almost 40 years later, not a whole lot has changed when it comes to the theories behind motion sickness. So pre-19th century, going a fair ways back, early on it was recognized by the ancient Greeks that seafaring causes sickness. And the word nausea actually is derived from the Greek word naus, which means ship. Now, there were lots of these homemade remedies and treatments back in the day, and these consisted of wine mixed with seawater, absinthe. So there's a bit of a trend there when it comes to these treatments. They all seem to involve alcohol. And being a Canadian, I guess I can say that, and knowing a lot of people from Europe, this seems to be a pretty typical European or even Canadian way to treat problems. If there's an issue, just drink more, and it should be resolved. And I can speak from experience that that's certainly not always the case. But pre-19th century, that seemed to be a reasonable course of action. And the last point here is that motion sickness was actually used as a form of punishment or torture. I'm not sure if they do that anymore, but it was certainly used back then. So moving into the 19th century now, and getting into World War II years, in the 30s and 40s, different theories started to arise. One of the big ones was this blood and guts theory. And the blood and guts theory basically means that, or is based on, that the gut shift caused sickness. So when there's motion, your gut moves around, and that's what causes you to be sick. In addition to that, circulatory system disturbances may also cause you to be sick. And one of the theories, I think, talked about cerebral anemia. So when you move around, your circulatory system is disrupted, which causes a lack of blood flow to the brain, which causes then, in some way, shape, or form, you to vomit. And a lot of these theories in the blood and guts camp were demonstrated through observation, or people saw this happen, so that kind of supported this theory and that strengthened the theory. In addition to that, the other strong theory at that time, was that this had something to do with the vestibular system. And Irwin and Duchampeau were the main drivers behind this theory. However, at that time, they found it quite difficult to move these blood and guts guys off of their soapbox, even though they had strong scientific evidence and support for the vestibular system theory. In addition to some of the research they did to bring about this scientific evidence, they also got some support from some studies that involved people who had damaged inner ears. Most of these people didn't experience sickness, so this lended some credence to this theory that it had something to do with the vestibular system. Mind you, this was, in the early 19th century, and a lot of interesting remedies were still very popular. And you can take a look at Table 1 of the Reason and Brandt paper just to get a flavor for some of these remedies. It's a quite long and diverse list. Quite a few alcoholic beverages, though, I think still make the list. So still in the 19th century and moving towards World War II, some theories involving psychology started to pop up. And people thought that motion sickness was caused because people saw things or smelled things or feared things or were anxious about something. And that's what the driving force behind the motion sickness was. So I think even at that time, and certainly now, we would appreciate that the psychological factors have an influence on experience of motion sickness, but are not the primary cause of it. A few other theories that came up, but maybe didn't have as strong a staying power as the blood and guts or vestibular theory, were eye strain theory. And in the article they talk about when this theory came about, you'd see a lot of people on boarding ships wearing violet-colored sunglasses in order to try to fend off motion sickness. And this other theory of muscle sense. So this was a form of sensory confusion where the muscle senses were constantly excited because of the ship movement, and this constant motion would then lead to a disturbance in how your brain would interpret this external motion. So the fact that this is a bit of a sensory confusion theory, which is actually the most prominent theory even today, which we'll talk about in a little bit. I guess some people were on the right track, maybe just a bit off the target, but on the right track. So by the end of the Second World War, the vestibular theory was still the leader in the clubhouse, so to speak. And as what happens a lot of the times when you have war, it leads to an increase in research because many lives are at stake, and there's a lot of things that are at stake. And specifically in World War II, there was a need to transport a large number of people, soldiers, by ship. And this is what accelerated some of the research in motion sickness at that time. Mind you, the primary focus was still on remedies for motion sickness, not necessarily the causes of the motion sickness. Some of the equipment that was used to do the research used some 2- and 4-pole swings. I think some Canadian research was done using these wave motion generators, and also these roll pitch rockers, and these things basically simulated the movements of vehicles. So some of the significant findings from this period, and we're getting again closer, I think, to the target here, and the science and the theoretical approach has kind of evolved to a certain point, and it's getting a bit more refined by this point, and that's demonstrated by the findings. So motion sickness at this time was now being thought of as caused by a combination of angular, horizontal, and radial accelerations. And it was dependent on body position and an external frame of reference. Maybe it was also caused by small, independent head motions. And this was the first time that sensory conflict was mentioned in the literature. McIntyre wrote about it when he said an inflow of conflicting impulses from different receptors, in particular the internal ear and the eye, and that was the cause of the motion sickness. So after World War II, and moving into more contemporary times, mind you, this article was written in 1975, so contemporary meant 60s and 70s, but even today, as we'll talk about when we address the Blessed Al article, that the theory of sensory confusion is still the prevailing theory when it comes to motion sickness causation. So after World War II, even though they had a lot of hard data, it was interesting, but they said no unifying theory emerged. And this additional theory did emerge called otolithic overstimulation. So again, we're talking about the vestibular sensory system here, but specific to the otoliths. And this theory did have some evidence to support it. Over time, though, it was demonstrated that through other research that most of the evidence that supported this was actually incorrect. For example, this theory couldn't explain visually induced motion sickness. So why when people went to see movies, they would experience some motion sickness. If that was caused by overstimulation, well, that couldn't be caused by overstimulation of the otoliths. So there were certainly some gaps in that theory. and a lot of holes were poked in it. Significant developments in this period. One of them was there was a discovery accidentally of a preventative antihistamine to treat motion sickness. And the story here was that a pregnant woman was given a drug called Dramamine for hives. And she was prone to getting car sick. But when she was given this drug and started taking it, her car sickness went away. And she told her doctor about this, and the doctor found that quite interesting. And he probably contacted some of his other doctor friends, and some research was done and demonstrated that this type of antihistamine specifically was a good suppressant or mitigative pharmaceutical for motion sickness, and it's still something that's used today. In addition to that, the race to the moon revitalized some of the motion sickness research. So the more contemporary views really revolve around the theory of sensory conflict or sensory rearrangement. And this quote, I think, summarizes this theory quite well. Motion information signaled by vestibular receptors, the eyes, and the non-vestibular proprioceptors is at variance with the kinds of inputs that are expected on the basis of past experience. So what you are sensing differs from what you expect to be sensing, and this is this sensory confusion, and it's what causes or results in motion sickness. So there's two types of conflicts that are discussed in the Reason and Brandt paper. The first is this intermodality conflict. So this is between the eyes and the vestibular receptors, the semicircular canals and the otoliths. And then the second one, the intramodality conflict, which is between the semicircular canals and the otoliths themselves. So I found this model on the internet, and I'm sure it's not a perfect model, but I think we all appreciate models and looking at them. They help us to maybe understand concepts a bit better. Now, I do have a couple of issues with this model specifically. One, it's rather complex, includes a lot of different parts, a lot of different boxes, a lot of different systems, and it's not very refined. Like it looks to me, if you look around the periphery of the model, we have drugs, alcohol, experience, mental activity, blah, 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 and these look all to be kind of like moderating factors that can influence motion, the symptoms associated with motion sickness. But if you look at the central part of the model, we can see that we have, the visual system and the vestibular system plus the proprioceptors in the limbs, and all these things act in some way, shape, or form together, and the confusion between these signals and what you're expecting to experience is what causes this confusion and what leads to the symptoms that are associated with motion sickness. So I'm not going to go through the model in too much depth, but it's there for you guys if you want to take a closer look at it. So moving from the Reason and Brandt article into the Bless et al. Article. And in the Bless et al. Article, they basically talk about a refinement to the sensory conflict theory. So instead of this being, the sensory conflict theory being made up of two different types of conflict, this intra-conflict and inter-sensory conflict, motion sickness is primarily a result of a challenge to the internal representation of gravity, or your subjective representation of vertical. So they say you can have big differences between what's sensed and expected, the sensory information that's sensed and expected without motion sickness, provided though that the sensed vertical remains aligned with the subjective vertical. In the article, they make a very compelling case for this refinement. They talk and they cite many studies from sea, air, and car sickness, or that have looked at sea, air, and car sickness. Studies on micro and hypergravity. These studies, in fact, were the basis for this refinement, this proposed refinement of the sensory conflict theory. And as an example, one of the strongest pieces of evidence that supports this additional refinement was after being in 3G centrifuges for over 1.5 hours, subjects didn't experience motion sickness if they didn't move. And it was only pitch and roll head movements that provoked motion sickness. The brief discussion they give on simulator sickness, in my mind, doesn't lend much support to this refinement of the sensory conflict theory. And in addition to that, there's a little bit of stuff on clinical vertigo, but we don't have a whole lot of time to get into it. So I think we're 25 minutes in, and I try to do a decent job of covering just kind of the high-level stuff and the important points from the 3 articles. So maybe time to open up the floor to you guys, and wish I could be there to be involved in the discussion, but I'm not. So, but here's a couple of options for discussion points. The first one I talked about previously. It's clear that virtual reality can provide some benefits for transfer of training of some skills or tasks, but do you see any risks of using virtual reality for training? Implications for virtual reality and virtual environment design due to what we know about motion sickness. So, as HF practitioners or researchers or whatever context you work with in human factors, do we fully account for and mitigate motion sickness in the design of virtual environments? Or is it reasonable to accept this risk and just treat the symptoms? So we know that use of virtual environments, especially ones that maybe don't consider motion sickness specifically and how you can mitigate motion sickness, are going to lead to motion sickness. How important is it that we avoid this, the cause of motion sickness and the symptoms of motion sickness when using virtual environments? Or we just accept the fact that this is a byproduct of using these environments for research or for training, and then just use the latest and greatest treatment methods. And the last potential discussion point is how important is it to operationalize motion sickness? So the Bless article uses quite a bit of mathematics to support their theory, and I know that it's not the first time that motion sickness and the factors that cause it has been operationalized or put into some type of a mathematical model. But is this something that's needed? Do we need this to design better virtual environments or virtual reality? Or can we get away with just kind of qualitative data when we're designing virtual reality or virtual environments to try to mitigate motion sickness? Anyways, a few things to chew on. And I think I've left you guys a bit more time today, so that's good. So I'll be back again on Friday and talking a bit more about motion sickness then. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you on Friday.